The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind, the Tathagata. Today is day 6 of this 8-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate, this Rohatsu sesshin, the annual sesshin that memorializes the Buddha's coming to awakening by doing what he did. And so we sit for 7 days and nights, and theoretically through the 7th night, as well as people are encouraged to do a lot of yasa, the informal sitting that balances out and supports our formal sitting in the zendo. And of course, if we stay up all night, and then early in the morning, we see the morning star rising, and we can this time of year. It's off towards the southeast, and that gaze at that star triggered a deep, profound awakening experience in the Buddha. Now, we may not have a deep, profound awakening experience, but with 7+ days of deep and deepening zazen, we'll definitely make progress in our practice, even though I don't like to talk about progress. Practice normally comes about when there's some trigger. Sometimes, or actually quite often, we are aware of something beckoning to us just beyond our conscious mind. And often as children, this starts. And then sometimes something difficult happens. There's a car accident and somebody's killed. Somebody we know well, or somebody that is actually in our family, or a family member dies of some illness. And so we begin to wonder even more strongly about questions of life and death. And that is good, because not a single one of us or anyone else in the world since time immemorial has managed to escape death. It is a fact of life. If you are born, you're going to die. And so we have an idea of what that means. It's often filled with pain, fear, and there are some countries where death is a normal, understood situation. Generally, the Asian cultures, especially the Southeast Asian cultures. I have mentioned that in Thailand, when we were living there, we actually attended the funeral of one of the consulate employees in Chiang Mai, and it was pretty brazen in a way, because he had died of hepatitis. We had tried to get him, actually we were successful in getting him to a hospital, but he was too far gone. His liver was too far gone, and they managed to start it up again briefly, but then they couldn't keep it going, and so he died. He was young, and so we were naturally invited to the funeral. My husband at the time was the acting consul there. And so we went. It was out in the country. I don't remember exactly where, but it was not in the city. And we arrived, and the family was there, and guests were there, and continued to come. And the body of this man was laid out on about 1.5 feet high of sticks and not so much logs, but mainly thinner things than logs. And so there was chanting, and when it got to a certain point in the funeral service, The family washed his face with coconut milk, and each of us was given a stick of incense that was lit, and we walked around the bier, symbolically lighting the fire. And then we left, and the family actually lit the fire. It was pretty obvious what was going to happen. The body was going to be burnt, essentially publicly. And of course, in India, along the Ganges River, there's an area where they have ghats, they call them, where bodies are burnt on a very regular basis. I mean, quite frequently. People bring their deceased family members to the shores of that river, which is considered a very holy place to have your body burnt. And it's something that you can go and see. I don't know how many ghats there are, but quite a few, because the population of the city is quite large. And I imagine that surrounding villages in the countryside also bring their dead to be burnt there, because it is such a holy place historically. So in those countries, it's quite a natural, normal thing. They're mentally ill members of their societies are also completely embraced within the society, no matter how their strange behavior might be. And some of it's pretty strange. And so when we're back in the West, for a good length of time, and I don't remember when this actually began, but it was certainly going strong into the 60s and 70s, when there was a counter movement of hospice care that came out of England that encouraged family members to keep their dying member at home and take care of that person and begin to understand the process of dying. Not everybody's ready to do this, but it happens, and more, really, as people become more aware of the presence of death and less fearful of it, although I don't know if that actually happens. I think people still fear death. And some years back, a good friend of mine in Rochester, the next neighboring village here, was dying. He was in hospice care. He was in his very early 80s, and he had Parkinson's, but he was also very weak because he did not want to walk anywhere. He just wanted to stand at his easel and paint. And the very large painting that's in our dining room here was painted by him. So he really didn't like activity, which was sad because he began to fail physically when it wouldn't really have been something that was ready to happen. And he started falling, because when you get too weak, you start to fall. And sooner or later, one of those falls is going to break a hip or some other bone, unless you're extremely sturdy. It took many years of my father, who also had Parkinson's, falling, and he was not weak. It's the Parkinson's would cause him to have what they call stop events, and Parkinson interferes with movement, and gradually over time your joints and your muscles stiffen up in such a way that nobody can move them. I remember trying to sort of get my father into his car. He was very tall, 6'3", and try to bend his legs to make it through the door, and it was extremely difficult to do that. That was the last time we took him for a ride, because it just became impossible to get him into the vehicle. At any rate, Alvaro, this man in the next village, got so weak, and I'm not quite sure what else was happening, but I heard from one of the local medical people at the local clinic that he was in hospice. And I went to see him. I mean, we were good friends, and I was frequently going to see himself and his wife. And so I went, and I remember going on a Friday and saying to him, he also wrote poetry. He was a very gifted person. He wrote haiku. He painted and was nationally known and internationally known as a painter. And he also composed music. And I remember at one point they were telling me that one of his symphonies was going to be played in Pennsylvania at a university. So I went, and he enjoyed writing haiku with one of our local neighbors here. And I told Richard that he was in hospice, and Richard had said to me, well, I want to go and write haiku with him, but I won't be able to go till Monday. And so I mentioned this to Alvaro, and he said, I won't be here then, which is very perceptive. He also had done many, many years, decades of Zen practice, and was the Dharma successor of a German woman who was dying of cancer, and so she sort of caused her senior students to become her successors. He didn't really get into teaching. He had a little sitting group, but it was very little, a couple of couples, and even eventually stopped doing that. And he died on Sunday. In these mountain villages, to have a family member at home while they're dying is considered the best way to go about things. And it's been done for centuries. And since the road was only paved, the highway up through Ojosarco from Santa Fe was only paved about 50 years ago. And there are still people who remember going to Santa Fe. It took 4 days to go down and come back in a wagon pulled by horses. It's a different century here in a certain way, although it's definitely changing, because the possibility of feeding yourself with raising mainly raising animals and raising the grain to feed the animals, because the growing season is so short that there's not much chance to raise much in the way of vegetables. But unless a family member requires extensive nursing assistance, and not just a certain level of it that hospice can provide, but extensive to the point where they've got to be in a nursing facility, they will be kept at home. It used to be that way in America, but there was that long period where people were so afraid of death that they would send their dying family members to the hospital in order to avoid being there when they died, which is a little bit sad. Some people prefer to die without people around, but others would like to have that comfort of family members, particularly if the family members were a positive experience for them. So back in the late 1920s, very early 1930s, there was a young Jewish woman living in Baltimore with a family, a husband and wife, and she wanted to go back to Germany because her mother was ill. And she was advised not to do that because there was a growing fascist movement and a lot of anti-Semitism building. and so her own life would be in danger, and that definitely turned out to be true. But then her mother died, and she mentioned to the hostess that she wished she'd been able to stand at her mother's grave and shed a tear. And what came out of that almost immediately, and this is a woman who'd never written poetry before, and just grabbed a paper shopping bag, a brown paper shopping bag, and scrawled it on the shopping bag. And Jared here is going to read that poem. You may know it.
Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there. I do not sleep. I am 1,000 winds that blow. I am the diamond glints on snow. I am the sun on ripened grain. I am the gentle autumn rain. When you awaken in the morning's hush, I am the swift uplifting rush of quiet birds in circling flight. I am the soft starlight at night. Do not stand at my grave and cry. I am not there. I did not die.
This is a very deeply understood Buddhist point of view, experienced by those that can understand and go beyond death in a conscious way. When we die, what does happen to us? There are cultures, particularly in the Middle East, where wailing and pounding your own body is an expression of mourning that is almost culturally required. And then there are other places where you have a funeral service. And it is said, I have not been to an Irish funeral, but I understand that at least in the old days in Ireland, there's a wake, which is typical with Catholic funerals. It's not the funeral itself, but it is a pre-funeral. And people have an uproarious time and actually will sometimes pull the deceased out of the coffin and dance with them. That's a very open way of receiving death. Other places, particularly in the very staid United States, people would have a closed coffin often because people didn't want to see a dead body. If one's family members were enlightened and open, they would go up and view the body and perhaps even touch it. But many people were just too afraid of it. They were afraid that if they touched death, they'd die soon. They'd be the next one. Sort of like when the bride tosses her bouquet and the person who catches it is theoretically estimated to be the next person to get married. Well, in this case, you touch the body and maybe they think you're going to be the next one to die. The Navajo, the Diné peoples, Native Americans, do not touch dead bodies. And in fact, they have the Hopi Native Americans bury their dead. The Diné, I've learned a little bit more of that because we have had a couple of Diné women veterans at our women veterans retreats here at Mountain Gate. And one of them described when her uncle had died. And her uncle had been a shaman, I believe. And there was a great deal of competition between her side of the family and a different side of the family to claim the body to the point where it got kind of vicious. Because there's a very strong sense, and this is an accurate sense, really, that the energy around the dead body is going to, I guess you could say, infect the dead person. and affect their next life and their trajectory from this life. We have something similar in Buddhism too. It's traditional not to touch the body after death, and instead to let it lie in state, so to speak, for up to 5, 6, 7 days. And with Alvaro, the local funeral home was trying to discourage that, so that they just wanted to grab the body and cremate it. And so that's what his wife allowed them to do. But in general, you wait to allow the essence of the being that has died to completely let go of the body. And let go is really the right term. And then you give it a number of days where that can happen, and then you go ahead and bury the body or cremate it. You don't embalm the body because that is kind of interruptive of the process. And there you go. And I can support that, really, because my mother dropped dead of a major heart attack. Just boom. She was clearly having a heart attack when you look at it in hindsight, but her body just couldn't handle it. We think that she probably had heart attacks every year, what she called the flu, but it really manifested more as a heart attack. And her mother also had 3 heart attacks before she died. But in this case, the last one was solid, and she basically flatlined. And she was taken to a funeral home. Well, first to the hospital to be deemed dead, and then she was taken to a funeral home. They let me, they held her until I could get there from New Mexico. She died in North Carolina. And the experience for me it wasn't startling, but it was interesting. She was not the only recently dead person I had ever seen. And it was very clear to me that she was still quite attached to her body, perhaps didn't even realize that she was dead. And this can happen. Particularly with a sudden death, it's such a shock and such a radical change that people don't actually realize that they're dead. And the idea was just to go and have her body cremated and not to delay it at all. And it was my father's choice, which we honored. But it was so clear that she was in a state of a combination of shock and anxiety that it wasn't going to be good for her to be cremated immediately afterwards, because if you have any consciousness left attached to the body, it's going to freak. And as we were about to pull out of the parking lot of the funeral home, the hearse bearing her body blocked our way and got out first. They were taking her to be cremated. So that's a rough thing to have happen. Roshi Kapleau was originally planning to be cremated, and then he had second thoughts about it. And he was not embalmed. He actually laid in state his coffin in the Rochester Zen Center in the Zendo, in the main aisle of the Zendo, for 3 days. And then during a chanting service, the coffin was closed, and he is actually buried at Chapin Mill. What is life? What is death? We say a special echo during our chanting. This universe, existing everywhere yet nowhere, is like a dream. And if you get back into human relations with essentially all of us, conditioned, some of us really negatively conditioned, some of us a little bit of conditioning, but all of us are conditioning. You don't get born and grow up without adopting some level of conditioning or being exposed to some level of that. And it is helpful in terms of living in society. You get to know, you get to understand the mores, the expectations of society, and because if you don't, it's not going to be fun. Lots of negative things could happen to you. So, unfortunately, sometimes a lot of negative things happen to you before you grow up, or even as you're growing up. And that conditions you to making assumptions about yourself. It's a classic situation of conditioning. And when we grow up with the underlying feeling that we're no good, which is extremely typical of Westerners, then it can be very, very difficult. Interactions with other people are often fraught with challenge. But through our Zazen, we can become free little by little, inch by inch, actually millimeter by millimeter, really. It takes time to both see where we're caught and then to be able to process it through and let it go. But it can be done, and as we continue to do that, we become more and more and more free. It's a little dying, actually, when we begin to let go of these ideas of who we are, which are quite solid. We've turned them our self-image. We think that's who we are, but that's not who we are. And through our practice, we begin to sort of unweave that tapestry of who we assume we are and begin to walk into little bits of freedom from the tyranny of that self-image. It is quite remarkable, the power of your practice. It takes a lot of faith because there's no guidelines, really. We can say, you sit down here in the zendo or in a chair and or wherever else in your house or apartment, or even outdoors. If you're hiking, we used to sit out in the forest, doing a lot of sitting when we were hiking in the Santa Fe Forest, the Pecos National Forest, Carson National Forest, in the old days. It's quite wonderful to hike for a long distance and then to sit down and just settle your body and focus your mind, which is already partly focused simply because of the exertion and the focus of hiking. In fact, we had planned initially to have hiking sessions here at Mountain Gate, but we tried it for 4 years, and every single year the universe conspired to prevent it from happening. The first hiking session we planned was going to be 4 days. People were going to gather here. We were in Sesshin at Tahoma Monastery back on Whidbey Island in Washington State when the Twin Towers fell. And chaos ensued. For 3 days, there were no flights anywhere. It was quite interesting because the skies were so silent. And then they began to pick up, but there were a lot of people stuck in places they weren't planning to be stuck in. And so there were 3 of us there at that sesshin, and we decided to rent a car and drive from Seattle to Mountain Gate. Only we had to bypass it because we'd left the Mountain Gate Jeep in Albuquerque. Many people had to go long distance. When I went to the AAA offices back then, you actually got maps. And there was a crowd of people. The whole place was full of people wanting to get maps and directions to where they were going back to. And they would say, where are you going to? I'm going to Maine. Where are you going to? I'm going to Florida. And so on. It was, people were going to have to take very long trips to get home. We got the last rental car in Seattle. And we drove back to New Mexico, stopping overnight at people's houses that I knew personally. Dale Ridenauer, who's now living in Ojosarco. That was our first stop in Kalispell, Montana, from Seattle. And then our second stop was a very long drive. It was 18 hours drive down to Denver, where Dane and Henry was living and teaching at the Denver Zen Center back then. And he and I were old friends too. And then the last bit was down to Albuquerque to get the car, turn the rental car in, and come back to Mountain Gate. It was quite a journey, but it was very interesting because everywhere you stopped for gas or something to eat, you met other people in the same boat. And there was a great deal of support and friendliness in that. But there was also the horror of what had happened and how many people had died. And that was before cell phones were really available to everybody. We didn't have a cell phone, but the ones that did have cell phones very generously allowed people to borrow their cell phones to call and either make arrangements or connect with loved ones. In my case, every single member of my family could have been either in the Pentagon or in one of those centers or on one of those airplanes. My sister and my younger sister, and her husband actually were flying to France from New York. I mean, they were actually flying from Atlanta, but through New York. My younger sister had many meetings in the World Trade Centers. One of my kids had been working at the Pentagon, and my other kid was traveling all the time. And in fact, one of his coworkers was on one of those planes. He had left a day early in order to fly back to LA because his wife was about to have their second child. And of course, he didn't make it. And, you know, there was a lot of trauma in the United States about that. My younger grandson, who at the time was 4 years old, and of course they replayed and replayed and replayed the photographs or the movie of the airplanes flying into the World Trade Centers and blowing things up and the buildings falling. And he wondered why airplanes kept flying into buildings. At that time, there was death everywhere. It was a quite horrific time in the United States in particular. We'd never had something that major. Europe had seen many world wars and cities bombed and many, many people killed. And so that was not such a strange experience for them. But for Americans, and our last war was quite a long time ago, and not anywhere near as vicious as this one. And so I should say our last war on our own land, our own American soil. So it was especially traumatizing. But again, it brought many people to wondering, what is death? And it's worth wondering about. It's worth exploring. Because life really is eternal. And it's not that you die and then you either go to heaven or hell or to purgatory to wait for a while. Your life continues. And you can wonder, how does it continue? Without a body, how does it continue? And yet it does. So what happens after we die? It's a very important question, and one worth really exploring. And also, what is dying like? Well, we actually do it many times over, in days and weeks and months and years. Every time you're embarrassed, there's a little dying to your attachment to self-image. Every time you get angry and there are results, there's a little dying. And as you do Zazen, there's a little dying every so often. First of all, it's not that easy in the beginning to focus your mind. We have the extended out breath that makes a major difference in that. But it's hard to focus our minds, particularly if we have some sort of background noise of some sort, and most people have background noise. And they do it in order to avoid encountering silence, having to think, or the possibility of thinking, the possibility of wondering. People will do all manner of things to avoid that, which only keeps us trapped longer. There was an East Indian sage, Ramana Maharshi, who, when he was 14 years old, he was sent from where he was living, where his family was living, to live with an uncle in order to continue his schooling in an excellent school. And he had demonstrated the ability to focus, even as a kid. And he was in boarding school, and it was well known that you could, the other kids could just pick him up and take him somewhere as he's solidly asleep, and he would stay solidly asleep and find himself waking up someplace strange, because that was a big joke for them, because he was able to focus so well. That was an advantage. It's not necessarily an advantage for us, because we are so accustomed to distracting ourselves, particularly since the digital age, where we have these little telephones that are really mini computers. And in a flash, we can look up something or make a call or text somebody. And we are so tempted to do that so frequently that we're able to effectively distract ourselves from being in the moment just as it is, which is makes it more difficult to do Zazen. But every time we pull our mind back to the breath, we are making a choice to let go of distractions, to walk into the possibility of dying. And because we're so conditioned to avoiding it, it's difficult for a long time. And many people don't persist, which is sad, because it is an incredible avenue to freedom, real freedom. But as we work on it, we gradually are able to focus more and dive more deeply into into the unknown. And as we do so, we become more comfortable with silence and with letting go, because we can't go into the unknown without letting go. And keep it up, and we'll go through all kinds of times where we are frustrated or bored or ready to quit. Roshi Keplo had said that when he was at Hoshinji in Japan in the 1940s, there were many times when he was ready to leave. And he said at one point he even got to the front gate with his suitcases packed before, he said, he regained his senses and went back in for more deep work. Thankfully so. So Ramana Maharshi already had a leg up on that. And of course it was way back 1930s, 40s. No, it was earlier than that, I think, where life was more simple, even in India, where it's very complex and busy. And so one day he was startled by a profound fear of death. And he kind of thought, went through his family members, nobody was sick or ready to die, old. Nobody he knew was on the verge of dying. So he decided to explore it, see what dying was like. And he imagined, he lay down on the floor and imagined him dead, no longer breathing, his body stiffening, and then he mentally saw himself being carried to the burning grounds. And out of that, he had a most profound awakening experience that lasted his entire life. He spent many weeks after that in a deep samadhi. And people came forth to help take care of him, actually. He left his uncle's home and initially went to a place of, I think it was a kind of temple. Nobody was there. But when the kids discovered him, they would throw pebbles at him, trying to get a rise out of him of some sort. And he was so deeply focused and in his ongoing experience of deep awakening that it didn't bother him. And finally, somebody got to him and took him into a basement somewhere where he was a little more protected against the local kids. And he ended up becoming a great sage. Roshi Keplo knew him personally. He went on a pilgrimage, and that included India, and stayed at the ashram for some time. But here's a man who, instead of fleeing from the sense of dying and the fear of dying, instead turned and went into it deeply. And this is what we're called upon to do. Most of us don't have that intensity of a fear, although it'll come up periodically, and it often will come up during Zazen, particularly as we get deeper in our Zazen. But there's your golden opportunity to tune in, to experience it, and explore it. And you do that often enough and deeply enough, and you also will have a deep awakening experience. So when you find yourself afraid of death, or you hear an ambulance going by and you tear up around it. Go right into that sense, that inner exploration of dying. Even imagining yourself dying. Because as you get closer and closer to your Kensho experience, it may well feel like you're honestly dying. There are a number of people I've known personally who have felt that they were literally dying. But they let go, and they were dying really to their ideas of who they were, which were mistaken anyway, and opening to who they really were. And there's tremendous freedom in that, because to live captivated, or captured, I should say, not captivated, well, sometimes that too, captured by your self-image is nowhere near freedom. It can be dreadful. And to be free of that is simply amazing. Not to have that straitjacket on you anymore, but to be able to move freely and compassionately, naturally wise, and naturally sensing of the optimal way to move in every given moment. So I hope on the 6th day of Rohatsu Sesshin, you'll take these words to heart and really dive in. Walk into any fear that comes up. Taste it. Feel the sensation in your body. And if it gets to be close to overwhelming, go in as far as you can, and then back out a little bit. And then go back in later. And gradually you'll get deep enough to truly see. So I thank you for listening. Sorry for the coughing and for going a little bit over time, but it was important. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.